Welcome to tonight's class, Plant Layout and Design. For people who don't know me, my name is David Smith. I'm a senior piping designer in the piping group. I went to a little bit about my background. I went to an engineering college in England for 5 years. I qualified with my engineering degree in '82. I've been piping designing ever since. I came to the USA in 1990, actually 1989. I started working for Parsons, and 1990. So I've been working for Parsons for 17 years. What my background experience is, I've been working in the Shell refinery for 5 years, doing the maintenance operation. I've been working in the project management teams, and I've also done about 4 or 5 projects in construction for Worley Parsons. So that's been. So we're going to start tonight looking at the plant layout, the unit relationship. I'm just going to start by reading out from page 5 in your handouts here, and I'll just go through it and I'll explain it as I go through it. A good site layout should achieve an economic balance of the requirements of safety, environmental construction and operations, maintenance, vehicle movement within, and 2 main public highways, future expansion and process relations, by the owner and regulatory code requirements. Where new facilities are planned within an existing live plant, minimum disruption of the existing plant may be of a primary concern. The relationship space arrangement of a plant items is a critical feature of the design of any facility and has a significant impact on the safety and both the installation of running costs. So basically we have a lot of criteria of how we actually space out a lot of our equipment, as I'll explain as I go through here. Site location, plot area, topographical drawings, climate conditions, together with locations of feed services will normally be available to us. The client will give those to us early on when we start doing the grassroots design facilities. From there we'll start extrapolating it into a layout, so into a plant facility. Part of these, let me see now. The following elements will start to define the site. The sort of major things we look at when we start doing a grassroots facility. We're looking at main gate, personal buildings, regards to access to existing roads, location of flares and process areas. We want them to be crosswind to one another and downwind of personnel areas. Location of pipelines, tie-in locations, locations of power lines, interface association with, if we do have other process and utility plants we have to tie into. Topographical data will affect a lot of our plant layout, our design, our requirements. Normally we put things like tankage storage areas. For example, we put them in a low point of an area rather than at a high point of a grassroots facility. Normally in a multi-unit site layout is developed in block format, as we see in the layout right here. A square grid is usually developed. The layout would generally follow process flow requirements, minimizing piping runs between unit blocks and location of unit feeds and product vessels, and we would locate product vessels local to battery limits. Again, it's just to save money and stop inefficiency and routing of piping and to cable trays, etc. Exotic materials and very large bore pipeline runs should be as short as possible to minimize costs, whilst allowing for adequate flexibility to account for expansions of the contraction. Common process units, utility units, control rooms and substations should be centralized for economy. We don't want to, if we got some units here, we wouldn't put some substations to the side where we'd have to run them a long distance. We put them centralized. Again, it will be to limit the routings. Tankage and administration buildings will generally be positioned around the periphery of the site. Sources of high noise should be identified and checked, made for minimum noise requirements. Certain equipment has high noise values, and we have to do acoustic type calculations to see if we need to put some form of buildings around them or away from personnel. Anytime we do a plan, we always have to consider future expansion. Client comes to us with a need, but that need always usually includes a phase 2 or a phase 3 or even a phase 4. I just turn to page 6, operation and maintenance. If this is our units here, what it shows roads, access around typical units. Access should be provided for firefighting and damage control in the plant. Main access roads within the site should run north-south, east-west direction and perpendicular to one another. It's just because it's easier to get from A to B, and if you start making roads and crossing them over, it gets a little bit cumbersome, and so it's easier to keep it square, and as we see here in the plan. Process units should have access from at least 2 directions and staggering across into the units from both sides. The site should have at least 1 emergency access egress in addition to the main entrance, and be surrounded by an internal perimeter road and security fence. Dead ends should always be avoidable. I mean, obviously it's always good to have a road which goes round the whole plant. And where we have units, where obviously it's best to have a road all the way around it. It allows for emergency vehicles or even maintenance vehicles to get in and out a lot easier. And of course, if we have an entrance, we're going to have an egress and exit. A lot of our safety requirements in the plant layout is segregation of process units within large and multi-plants is necessary in order to reduce the risk of fire spreading. This is normally achieved by segregation each process units with roads. We'll go into the next section. I'll give you a little bit more details on segregation of the units. Let's see. Each process unit from the roads and equipment is set back safe distances from the edge of such roads. These roads should preferably surround the units to good firefighting access. Firefighting access should not normally provide through the unit or under pipe racks. Obvious reason. You want to, if there's a fire inside a unit, you want to go around it and not through it or underneath a pipe bridge. Toxic, acidic and dusty equipment within the plant should be separated by groups, handling similar commodities together, often within a curbed area. For example, if we have some dusty equipment where it's filters or something of this nature, and rather than have them spread out everywhere, we'll try and put them in a little area, usually inside a building, where we can control the air or something like this. If we have some caustics or acids, we'll locate them together and put a little collection area around them. Firewater ring mains usually surround each unit. They will supply the hydrants and monitors, which will be either fixed to foam insulation or water if as required. Making tanks are usually located close to the point of application. In some remote locations where water or firefighting is scarce, increasing space between the equipment process plant facilities may be required. Other fire protection criteria such as active versus passive methods needs to be considered. That's just basically having there'll be an active system which will always be there and ready. If for some reason that breaks down, there may be a passive one which they can always go for a backup for firefighting. Or it may even be some truckable type fire equipment they can bring in with tankage, etc. to consider a fire problem. Main administration buildings and fire stations should be designed for requirements of blast resistance and positioned close to main entrances. Obviously we don't want to put a fire station right next to a unit where the problem may occur. It's going to have to be somewhere where they can mobilise and quickly get to the unit. And so of course the same with the administration buildings. In case of major failure and leakage from storage tanks, they should be located within the abundant area. We'll get more into that when we look at the equipment considerations. Equipment generally should be located at the lowest possible safe elevation. As I said before, is when we do our tankage area, we'll look at the topographical area of the plant, and we'll have to consider the wind direction, the flare area, and where we have a low area is where we'll consider, well, we'll have to put the tankage in a low area. Obviously, if we've got leakage, large volumes of liquids, we don't want it to be in a high point, it'll be in a low area. Environmental considerations should be incorporated into the layout. Effluent treatment plants should be should not be sited adjacent to residential or similar type property. Toxic, non-toxic and surface water drainage systems should be separated and proper means of disposal built into the layout. So if we did have some a lot of this depends on a lot of times when we do grassroots layouts, there's very little residential area around. Then usually after they're built in operation, then people tend to move into the area. But it's always a consideration for the client and the local environment. Plot plan alignment. Generally, the process units will be positioned in process flow order. The common utility blocks are positioned to provide economical and effective services. This is just saying if we have these blocks here, which are our process units, we don't want to have our utility areas at one end. It means we've got a long route to get to, say, the end unit. I mean, to get the pumps operation to pump it from this side to this side, obviously there's a lot of costs involved. The easiest way is to kind of keep it central to all the operating units. Elevations of various units should be determined early to establish a common site datum and relative elevations between units. We'll have a topographical map which will show us the elevation of the area, but we don't tend to use that elevation. We'll go ahead and we'll just have a standard datum, and we'll set our standard datum for the whole plant. It's usually 100 feet, and that way it keeps it easy for comparing one unit to another unit. Because if we go by a topographical, it makes them say something like 116 feet 12 inches, so we'll just round that to 100 feet, and on the civil drawings we'll put a reference there to the topographical elevations. A well-designed plan should have a uniform functional appearance. This document can not be replaced by skill or good layout engineering. Through experience, we'll be able to sense whether or not layout meets the guidelines outlined in this document. Usually, if it doesn't look right, it won't be right. I mean, if you got something like this where you can see that you can get from one unit to another unit, you can get to operations building, maintenance buildings quite easily, then you know you got a winning type of design. But if you start crossing off roads and moving moving units around so it's not so like this, it just doesn't look good. And I say it's operations of client operations maintenance, they just won't like anything which is not an easy path from getting from one unit to another unit, getting from maintenance or buildings or operations buildings to a unit. Buildings, following type of buildings we have to consider in the front end layout type design would be control rooms, substations, firefighting pump house, analyst house, sample stations, administration buildings. Control rooms, substations and instrument houses should be located in a safe area in a common cable run to and from the plants. Recognition should be given to where the main power enters the plant and to heavy electrical power uses such as compressors or air coolers. MCC substations are often elevated for ease of cable routing in and out of buildings. That will be based on a unit by unit basis. We'll find a common area inside each unit rather than for the whole plant. Okay. And this next slide here, this is basically a section view which basically covers the same things. Things like the air coolers, I'm going to talk about when I get to the equipment and some of the construction effects we can have on the plant. We'll talk on the equipment. Now, one thing which is not in here, which one thing we always tend to put into our design, it's like your car, it's like your vehicle. To run this plant, you got to maintain them. You got to take out equipment. You got to put new equipment in there. And a lot of the time, the client doesn't want heavy equipment coming through his maintenance, the main entrance to the facility. You're going to have large cranes. You're going to have large vessels. You can have pipe racks. And a lot of times, what we'll design into a plant layout is a back door, if you wish. It'll be like a construction maintenance area. It's also when we have scheduled shutdowns. There may be a lot of construction personnel coming in for a period of weeks. and then they'll leave during the turnarounds. And we'll design into the plant somewhere where we can bring in heavy equipment, but normally that gate will be closed. It may even be fenced off and never used, but during points of major construction, they'll probably open that and they'll put a security gate there and monitor the equipment coming in and monitor the personnel coming in there. That's usually a temporary, but it's something that the operators and maintenance consider during their plant layout. Sometimes when we get into grassroots facilities, a lot of times a lot of issues, I'll go through this very, very briefly, there's always discussions and concerns on community problems. You know, it was where we may locate the entrance to a facility or an exit to a facility, and there's always concerns on trucks and etc. And what I put in here is it's just a print about from American Petroleum Institute. It shows some of the things that we do consider. A lot of it is already discussed and sorted out by the clients before we get involved, but sometimes we do get involved in the meetings and have to consider some of these items. I'll just briefly go through the headings, but if you want to go over the websites at the bottom, if you want any more details. But basically we're saying that the oil and natural gas companies aim to be active and responsible members of the community in which they operate. The industry recognises that it derives its licence to operate from the public, and that companies and the industry need to work harder and more creative to preserve the right to operate. And if we don't consider people outside the facilities, we can't design and do the layout of facilities. It may be from water runoff to entrances or access facilities. Sort of things that the companies we get involved in will consider. They're looking at health programs, volunteer programs, relief programs, and youth programs, and also the disaster preparedness programs. One thing we can't get away from in plant layouts is we do obviously have problems. And if you look at this, for every pro you'll see a con. And it's the same if you go to the environment. There may be discussions during our front-end layout designs on environmental issues. And of course, a lot of things we'll always have to discuss and consider is from the equipment is the air problems, fuels, climate changes we may implement on there, health and safety problems associated with a plant layout or a plant itself, problems with water, where the water comes from, discharges into water, and that's the same with the groundwater, where the seepage may go to. Energy efficiency and recycling is always a topic of discussion as well. But these, I'm not going to go into any details, but you can go to the American Petroleum Institute if you want to know more. But but a lot of this, it usually comes out in the very front end of the design, and once the layout's kind of established, then it's taken over by the client. This is page 17 in your handout. What we're looking here is just a typical considerations on a plant layout. The other one was a unit, but here inside a plant, there's sort of things that we have to consider to make it uniform and maintenance easier. Let's see here. If we have, say, air coolers here, we have raised platforms. We have to have access and egress to all platforms. We can't. We have certain requirements. One of them is we can never have dead legs on a platform of more than 20 feet. More than 20 feet, we have to put an egress. We've got long platforms. We can never put somebody who's going to be more than 76 feet or 25 meters away from a platform. So if we have a long platform, every 150 feet, we would have another egress. But we can never have somebody more than 76 away from a ladder at any time. And that'll be consideration of our platform layout and design. Where we have towers and columns, we have equipment on there which we have to consider layout areas for pulling and maintenance equipment out. When we actually design or do the layout on the pipe rack, where we have a battery limit, I'll look at battery limits a little bit more later, but also we have flexibility in our piping systems. And each pipe rack we will consider an area where we have to put loops and maybe a raised area of steel to support the expansions of the facilities within the unit. We'll space all the columns. We usually space all pipe rack columns every 6 meters, 20 feet. And that's basically based on design criteria of a 2-inch line, which can span 20 feet. Less than 2 inch cannot span that way. But basically, that size basically sets the spacing on the pipe racks. When we get multiple equipment, such as these exchangers, we'll pull them out towards a road area or a maintenance area. But to keep it uniform, we'll line up the shell heads. We'll keep them in line. And same if we have multiple pumps, rather than having them staggered, we'll keep them lined up. It just makes it look uniform, and it just keeps the unit looking clean. And also, if we were to have some equipment which was raised up and it was inside a structure, we'd line up the columns on the pipe rack. And if we had a structure outside, we'd line up the columns. Otherwise, you get columns everywhere, and it's tough to route piping in there, and it just looks a real mess. So it always looks clean when we do our layout, just to line up the equipment and line up the steel columns.
So when they're actually putting these things in place, do we have someone from our company out there and make sure that they do put it where they're supposed to? Or?
Yes, we do. No, they have to put it right. Well, obviously we have engineering drawings which tells them exactly the location it has to be done. In this case, it'll be the civil drawings for piles or structural drawings for columns. But they have to put it exactly where it is. Yeah. And it will be verified. We have inspectors and engineers in the field as well who will have to sign off. Anything which would, after engineering, when we get into construction, we basically do the supporters on that as well. Okay. This is just a typical section through on the typical unit. So things we'll have to look at and try and keep clean. We have access ways. Usually, underneath a pipe rack, we will maintain usually a 12 feet head height clearance. Some clients prefer more. But a lot of it's to do with getting equipment through there. It may be a forklift, it may be a light truck, or maybe it's just something, a little crane to pick up some equipment. But we will have requirements here to maintain this and keep it a straight line as well. Same on back ends of equipment. We will go ahead and we'll keep a space area here clear. And this won't necessarily be all the way across the unit, this will just be behind the exchangers. And same on this one here. This is actually a reboiler. But here, behind this equipment, if we do have manifolds or a pump at this area here, we will go ahead and we will keep this area clear for operators and maintenance to go down the equipment and do their inspection and maintenance. We will locate, when we have a pipe rack like this, our tendency is we'll always have on the top deck, we'll keep that space available for electrical instrumentation. We will put our utilities on the middle deck, utilities being water, air, steam, condensate, maybe plant air as well as instrument air, and we'll tend to put our process piping on this bottom deck. Sometimes we're out of space, we may go on the top up here. But when we do our layout, when we do our design, our client will stipulate a future expansion requirement. Sometimes it can be 30–40%, and that will tell us that we cannot. We got to leave 30 or 40% of whatever space we have on these decks clear, free. Sometimes we'll put cantilevers on the outside of a pipe rack, and that's for future expansion. So we will be under a requirement to leave a certain amount of the space clear. Our tendency was to put control manifolds down at grade. It's easier for the operator to maintain it. Sometimes we do have a process requirement to not pocket a system, so we may have to raise that platform up, raise a control manifold up and put a platform underneath it. But if possible, we'll always bring control valves down to grade and just make it easy for operators to maintain them. If we do have a group of control valves in the same area, rather than having them all staggered different heights, the requirement is usually 1 inch from a drain valve, is to have 12 inches below a drain valve. But rather than have them all staggered at a different height, we'll just keep it all uniform, and we'll just set early on in the project the elevation and all the control valves and keep it uniform that way. And again, it just helps keep it all uniform and makes it clean for the operators, rather than going up here, down low. Just keep it simple. Usually simple works. One One of the problems we have when we do this layout for a piping in here is usually the flare system. The flare system has to be non-pocket, it has to be sloping, and usually we can't fit it in a pipe rack, so we would normally have to take the flare and we would put it onto the side here. Or if we didn't have air coolers on the top like this, we would have a tendency to put the flare on top of a pipe rack. If we did put it inside there, then the spacing between the two decks would be quite considerable. And the higher you go up for a pipe rack, obviously you have to go down deep on the foundations, and again, it's just costs and money. Going to recommended spacing for process units. We do have a lot of, and what we're trying to show on here is that a lot of our requirement is that we'll provide a minimum, where we have high maintenance equipment at grade, where it is a control valve or maybe a utility station. We do have, if we have utility stations, is basically is a set of 4 lines, which is steam, water, air, nitrogen, sometimes there may be another one in there, and we keep these down at grade, and we're just small little 1-inch lines, but the operators, maintenance, we use those for maintaining the equipment, washing equipment, and we have to put these down usually every other column line, and we do have to do we base it usually on the 50-foot holes, and we'll do from that, if there's a utility station here, we would put a little circle to make sure we do cover all the equipment so it can be maintained for the plant layout. But what we have here on the plant layout, one thing, even sometimes we do meet the requirements, which is say between these 2 exchanges here, we've got some control valves. The requirement would be to say have 3 feet between the equipment. But one thing, even though we do meet requirements, but what the operators are looking for, we don't want to be like a little zig in here. They want to walk down there and they want it to be straight. If we were to take a control, a hand wheel, move it out into the space, even though we got 3 feet clearance or we had an actuator which bent over, which kind of included into that area, but even if we still had 3 feet of clearance, he wouldn't like it, because he wants to walk straight. Because if he's carrying something, or he's got some maintenance or equipment, or he's looking that way, sometimes those control valves can dig into your side. So we're always looking for straight access ways and straight walkways. So, and one thing we'll get into later is a smart plant review, and that's where we show it to the client, and this is where he comments and gives us feedback as to what he wants and or what he doesn't like. A lot of these, I'm just going to just do some of these and go to the charts. Some of these equipment, we have to basically work with our process group, and basically what we have to determine is if it's a high hazard or low hazard, and that can usually be determined by the pressure or the temperature of a piece of equipment. If it's a high hazard, high temperature and high pressure, we'll have different spacing requirements. It may be from the edge of a road. This may have to be 5 feet for a low hazard piece of equipment, or it may be 10 feet for a high hazard piece of equipment. Things like this is showing a heater here. Heater from a cooler is that if it's down at grade, if this is down at grade, then we have to consider 50 feet spacing right here. If you go to the next, there's actually a chart on page 22. And these basically saying the same as what's on this spreadsheet here, which is showing you the spacing requirements we have to consider. Let me just read. These recommendations have been developed as a result of a study of fire and explosion losses experienced throughout the country. The recommendations represent good practice being followed or being exceeded by many safety-conscious companies in the industry. Existing oil, gas and petroleum plants have been modified to operate at higher capacities and with greater facilities, larger or present or substantial increase in the risk potential. For these reasons, the initial site analysis, proposed new construction or addition should have a careful consideration for space allocations, water supply, drainage, outside exposure and fire protection facilities. A lot of times, a lot of our work we do is not, when we do a layout, it's not actually doing a new layout, but we may expand an existing layout. A lot of their facilities don't actually consider some of the size of the equipment which may be coming in, and that's just trying to say sometimes we have to allow a little bit more space than what's necessary. If you go to page 22, which shows some of the recommended spacing that we have to consider. On 22, this chart here, for example, if you look at the first line, the process unit, high hazard. I say high hazard is going to be high temperature, high rated equipment in there. There's obviously a potential for a problem. If you look down the chart here, so let me say, if you go down to say the last one, which is fire process heater, it's looking from a heater, it's looking for somewhere between 50 and 100 feet spacing from that equipment.